The year was 1883. The wind in the New Mexico territory did not ask permission. It just took. It scoured the high plains of Juniper Flats, peeling the alkali topsoil and wrapping it in long, choking ribbons around the rotted bases of the fence posts. The dust was red, the color of rust and dried blood, and it coated everything. It silted the troughs, gritty the blankets, and settled in the lines around a man's eyes. Maeve Hollis tasted that grit between her teeth. She was 27 years old, a woman made of sharp angles and saved words. The sun had already etched its map around her eyes, but it hadn't touched the fierce clarity of her gaze. She had come back to Cedar Gulch, the small, hardscrabble ranch her father had poured his life into, only to find it broken. The last norther had come through like a freight train, tearing the south pasture fence to kindling. Now, under the white-hot eye of midday, she fought the land for possession. She braced a new cedar post against the worn heel of her boot, trying to drive it into the baked, unforgiving earth with a heavy splitting maul. The impact shot a jarring shock up her arms, stinging her palms. The post stood defiant for a second, then sagged, drunk and useless, in the oversized hole. Maeve let out a low curse, a sound immediately snatched away by the wind. She wiped the streak of muddy sweat from her brow with a forearm. This land demanded payment in advance, and she was running low on currency. He appeared not as a man riding, but as a shape resolving out of the shimmering heat haze. He led a mule that looked as weary and patched as he did, Elias Rook. He was a ranchero from Rook's Draw, a place that was less a ranch and more a stubborn rumor etched into a dry canyon. His coat was a testament to hardship, the canvas patched with burlap and stitched with rawhide. His hands on the mule's lead rope were scarred, the calluses thick as old leather. Maeve tensed. Her hand dropped to the hatchet tucked in her belt. Out here, a stranger was a threat until proven otherwise, and proof was a slow, costly thing. Elias Rook stopped 20 yards off. He just watched her for a moment. His eyes were the color of slate, gray and calm, holding the stillness of water found deep under cypress roots. They held no judgment, no pity, only a quiet observation. He dropped the lead. The mule stood ground-hitched. Too exhausted or too broken to bolt, he walked not toward Maeve, but toward the tangle of ruined wire. From his mule's pack, he lifted a tight, heavy coil of used barbed wire. It was rusted, but serviceable. He set it on the ground, a careful distance from her. Maeve stared at the wire, then at his face. Her silence was a question. "Fences ain't for keeping cattle in," Elias said. His voice was low, rough like sandstone, but it carried, "They're for keeping your mind steady. A good fence lets a soul rest." Maeve Hollis looked at the ruined line, at the vast, empty expanse it was supposed to tame. She looked at the wire he offered. She gave a short, sharp nod. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was acceptance. He nodded back, as if a long conversation had passed. He picked up the post-hole digger that lay beside her failed attempt. He didn't ask permission. He simply found the spot where the old post had rotted, measured the distance from the last standing post with his own boots, and began to work. The twin blades of the digger bit into the hard-pan soil. Thud, clack, thud, clack. The sound was rhythmic, efficient. He worked with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent doing hard things without wasting energy. He set a pace that was slow but relentless. He was not helping her. Maeve realized. He was simply doing a job that needed doing, as if the broken fence was a personal offense to the order of the world. She returned to her own work, pulling the splintered remains of the old posts from the ground, her respect for him growing with every clean bite of his digger. He dug 3 holes in the time it took her to clear the debris from one. He set the heavy cedar posts, sighting down the line to ensure they were true, tamping the dirt around the base with his boot heel until each post stood as firm as a headstone. They worked in the oppressive heat without speaking. The only sounds were the thud of the tamper, the metallic complaint of old wire being stretched, and the incessant, scouring wind. That wind carried more than dust. It carried talk from Juniper Flats. Talk that had reached Maeve 2 days prior, delivered by the freight driver along with her sack of flour. Talk that prickled her skin worse than the heat. The talk was about Silas Merritt, her husband. He was her husband in the eyes of a territorial judge and a piece of paper she'd signed 2 years ago, back when she still believed in smooth words. Silas was a man who moved in shadows, a trader of beef who always seemed to have more cattle than his land could support. He was all charm when it suited him, and all cold violence when it did not. He had been gone for months, maybe 6, maybe 8. Time blurred out here, measured in dry seasons and wet, not in calendars. He had ridden out chasing a rumor of cheap land in the Arizona territory, or perhaps a different kind of rumor in Sonora. But the talk now was that he was coming back, not for her. He was coming back for the land. The railroad survey had staked a line just north of the county, and the speculators were following like vultures. Suddenly, Cedar Gulch, which sat on the only reliable aquifer in the section, was valuable. Silas was coming back to claim his property. And in 1883, in this territory, that property included the land her father had left her. It included her. The fence was not just for her mind. It was a statement. It was the only armor she had. By late afternoon, the posts were set. Elias uncoiled the wire he'd brought. He worked a stretcher tool from his saddlebag, a simple lever of oak and iron. He ratcheted the first strand tight, the wire groaning as it came taut. Maeve moved to help him, bracing the corner post with her shoulder as he worked the wire. The wind shifted. For the first time that day, the air didn't smell like baked alkali and creosote. It smelled of ozone, of damp earth from far away, distant rain. It was the scent of change, a promise of relief that could just as easily become the threat of a flash flood. They worked their way down the new line, their movements falling into a shared, silent rhythm. He stretched. She braced. He stapled. She moved to the next post. When they reached the last post, he held the wire taut. "Hold it here," Elias said, his voice quiet. Maeve grabbed the barbed wire, her thick leather work glove protecting her palm. He moved in, his own gloved hand overlapping hers, to wrap the wire's end around the cedar post. "The ranch knot," he said. He was not doing it for her. He was showing her. You wrap it twice, tight, then you kink it back on itself. Holds better than a staple. Won't pull loose. His movements were slow, guiding her hand to make the final twist. As he did, the worn, cracked leather of his glove brushed against the bare skin of her wrist, just above the cuff of her own. It was nothing. A graze. A functional accident. But the shock of it went through her like static. It was the first human touch she had felt in months that was not accidental or hostile. It was polite. It was directional. It was warm. A deep, living heat that seemed to penetrate the leather. Maeve's breath caught in her throat. She finished the knot, her fingers suddenly clumsy, then steadying, the pulse at her wrist, where his glove had touched, hammered a frantic beat against her skin. Elias stepped back. His gaze lifted from the finished knot to her face. His calm, gray eyes held hers. He saw the flush that had risen on her high cheekbones. He saw the sudden vulnerability she so despised in herself. He gave one slow nod, acknowledging the finished work, and perhaps acknowledging something more. Then he turned to gather his tools. The distance between them was restored. The sun began its final, violent descent, bleeding out across the western mesas. The sky turned a shade of fiery red, the color of an open wound. The promise of rain had evaporated, burned away by the day's relentless heat. And with the dying light came a new sound. Hoofbeats. Not the weary, earthbound plod of Elias's mule. This was a heavy horse, a grain-fed horse, pushed hard, cutting through the sand of the arroyo. Maeve's hand went back to the hatchet on her belt. Elias did not move, but he was no longer gathering his tools. He stood by the new fence line, his body poised, listening. He crested the rise, silhouetted against the blood-red sky. Silas Merritt. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder, running to thickness in the gut. He sat his expensive bay horse like he owned the animal and the ground beneath it. He wore a fine wool coat, thick with trail dust, and a new revolver strapped high and tight against his ribs. Across the pommel of his saddle, gleaming dully in the twilight, lay a double-barreled shotgun. He did not ride to the house. He rode directly to the fence line, pulling his horse up a dozen yards away. The animal blew, tossing its head, sensing the tension that had snapped taut as new wire. Silas's eyes, dark and restless, raked over the new line of stretched barbs. They passed over Maeve as if she were just another post in the line. They settled on Elias Rook. He let the silence stretch, drawing it out, thickening it. The air turned brittle, cold despite the day's heat. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was not a shout. It was a low, sibilant hiss that carried perfectly in the still twilight, a sound meant to crawl under the skin. "I see you're willing to stretch wire. For my wife." The air didn't just freeze, it shattered. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold. Elias remained perfectly still, against the darkening landscape. His patched coat and steady gaze seemed rooted, a part of the earth itself. He did not look at Silas. He looked at the fence. Silas's hand, resting near the shotgun, did not move. But with his other hand, the one near his belt, he slowly, deliberately, reached for the revolver at his hip. His thumb found the hammer. The sound cut through the dusk, the sharp, metallic click-clack of the hammer being pulled back to full cock. It was a definitive sound, a full stop at the end of a sentence, in the bitter sagebrush 20 feet away. A covey of quail, startled by the sudden, violent tension, erupted into the air. Their wings beat a frantic, desperate tattoo against the dying red light. The world, which had been painted in violent red, snapped into a cold, hard focus. Silas Merritt's thumb on the hammer was the only truth. "Get off my land, Rook," Silas said, his voice dropping into that same quiet hiss, "or I'll plant you in it." Elias Rook did not move. He did not look at the shotgun, nor at the revolver. He looked at Maeve. "No." Maeve's voice was a low crackle, dry as the dust. She moved. It was not a step back, but a step sideways, placing her body squarely between the hammer of Silas's gun and Elias's chest. "This isn't your land to order men off of, Silas." A dry, humorless laugh escaped Silas. "Is that so? I see a fence on Merritt property. I see my wife, and I see a vagrant. It seems simple enough to me." "It's Cedar Gulch," Maeve stated, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "My father, Arlen Hollis, left it to me. The deed is filed in Massilia. It's in my name, Hollis." Silas's amusement faded, replaced by a dark irritation. "Your father's paper, that's what you're standing on. A piece of paper against a loaded gun. This is the territory. Maeve, the law says what's mine is mine, and you are mine." "This land is not," she insisted, her chin lifting. Before Silas could answer, a new sound intruded. More horses, at a steady trot, coming up the main track from town. 3 riders. The setting sun glinted off the star on the lead man's vest. Sheriff Bo Kincaid pulled his horse to a halt, his deputies fanning out behind him. Kincaid was a man worn smooth by the wind and other people's troubles. He had a long, tired mustache and eyes that had seen too many arguments end this same way. "Silas," Kincaid said, his voice flat. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. "Put the hammer down." Silas glared. His authority challenged. "This is a private matter. Sheriff, just settling a fence line dispute with this." He waved the revolver toward Elias. "The hammer! Down! Now!" Kincaid's hand rested on his own holster, a casual, weary gesture that was more threatening than Silas's open anger. "I got a report of a disturbance. This looks like more than a disturbance. This looks like a hole about to be dug." With a sharp, angry sigh, Silas slowly, agonizingly, lowered the hammer on the revolver. The soft metallic snick of the mechanism releasing was the loudest sound in New Mexico. "He threatened me," Silas spat, holstering the weapon. "He was fixing my fence," Maeve countered, stepping forward. "A fence you let rot. This isn't about a fence. Sheriff, it's about the water. Kincaid's gaze sharpened. He nodded, as if a piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. Water. Well, that ain't settled with buckshot. That's a court matter. There's nothing to settle, Silas said, a new, ugly confidence in his voice. Kincaid ignored him. Mesilia Crossing, sunup. Judge Hollander is sitting. He'll hear the water rights claim. I expect all three of you to be there, and I expect all of you to make it through the night to be there. Save yourself the ride, Sheriff, Silas said. He reached into the pocket of his wool coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He spurred his horse forward, tossing the paper onto the dirt at Maeve's feet. It's already settled. Maeve stared at the paper as if it were a snake. Kincaid dismounted, his boots raising small puffs of red dust. He picked it up, opened it, and tried to read it in the failing light. What is this? Silas? It's a water contract, Silas announced, his voice booming with triumph. Filed and stamped by Mr. Abner Tolliver at the Territorial Bank. Says the primary access to the aquifer under this land is mine. Pending improvements. Seems I'm building a pipeline. Maeve snatched the paper from Kincaid's hand. Her eyes scanned the dense, legal text. Lien, prior appropriation, improvement bond. The words swam, but the meaning was clear. The document, signed by Silas and notarized by Tolliver, effectively choked her off. She could have the dirt. He owned the water beneath it. This is fraud, she whispered, the paper rattling in her hand. That's a matter for the judge, Silas smiled, wheeling his horse. He looked down at Elias Rook, who had remained silent, his hands resting on the handle of the post-hole digger. Elias finally spoke, his gaze fixed on Maeve. His voice was quiet, meant only for her, but it carried in the still, cold air. Water flows where it's cut. A person's heart finds its own level. You choose your path. Mrs. Hollis. I'll walk it with you. The use of her name, the quiet vow, was more shocking than the gun. It was a declaration. Silas's face contorted. He leaned over his pommel, his voice dropping back to that venomous hiss. Your path ends at the graveyard. Rook. That's enough, Kincaid snapped. Silas, you ride to town. You stay at the saloon or the hotel, but you don't come back here. Rook, you head back to your draw. Mrs. Hollis, you lock your door. I'll see you all at sunup. Silas gave Maeve one last look, a look of ownership and pure malice, before he raked his spurs and galloped into the darkness. Elias Rook watched him go. He slowly gathered his wire stretcher and the digger, strapping them to his mule. He looked at Maeve, who stood clutching the fraudulent contract, her knuckles white. He nodded once, a gesture of grim confirmation, and then he and his mule were gone, dissolving into the twilight. The night did not bring peace. It brought a waiting, heavy silence. Maeve sat at her small kitchen table, the contract spread out under the low flame of a kerosene lamp. The legal language was a cage. She had no money, no leverage. Her father's legacy was being stolen with a 10-cent stamp and a banker's signature. Around midnight, the smell of smoke jolted her from her exhausted stupor. It was not the familiar, comforting smell of her own chimney. This was the sharp, acrid scent of dry alfalfa burning. She ran to the door and tore it open. The sky to the north, where her haystack stood, was a sickening, pulsing orange. No, she breathed, and then she was running. She grabbed a pair of wet burlap sacks from the horse trough as she passed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The haystack was a mountain of fire. It was her entire winter's feed for the half-dozen heifers her father had left her. Without it, they would starve before the first snow. The heat was a physical blow, pushing her back. She heard it then, faint but clear over the roar of the flames, the sound of hoofbeats, and a high, yipping laugh, fading fast toward the east. The Copper Spur Boys. Men rumored to ride for Silas's freight protection racket. This was not a warning. This was an execution. No, she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She charged the fire, beating at the edges with the wet sacks. It was useless. Sparks flew, catching the dry grass around the stack. The fire was spreading. She beat at the new flames, desperation giving her strength. The burlap began to char and smolder in her grasp. The skin on her palms and fingers blistered, but she didn't feel it. All she felt was a cold, blind rage. More hoofbeats. Coming toward her, she spun, raising the smoldering sack as a weapon. "Maeve!" It was Elias. He rode in hard, his mule panting, and slid to the ground. He wasn't alone. 3 other men, lanky figures with shovels and axes, were with him. Nico Alvarez and 2 others from the draw. They had seen the glow. Elias grabbed the sack from her hand, throwing it to the ground. He caught her by the shoulders. "The stack is gone. We make a break." The grass. He didn't try to fight the inferno. He ran to the edge of the spreading grass fire, digging his shovel into the dirt, creating a line. The others followed, their tools scraping and cutting a wide, dark scar in the earth. A fire break. Maeve grabbed a fallen shovel and joined them. The handle was smooth, and the motion was rhythmic. Brutal. Dig, lift, throw. Dig, lift, throw. Her hands, already raw, began to bleed. She ignored it. They worked for nearly an hour. A small, desperate team illuminated by the dying. Massive fire. The haystack collapsed in on itself. A tower of roaring embers. But the firebreak held. The pasture was saved. They stood, leaning on their tools, chests heaving, faces black with soot. The air smelled of ash and defeat. Maeve looked down at her hands. In the red glow, they looked like raw meat. The skin was shredded, weeping. Now that the work was done, the pain rushed in. A white-hot flood that made her knees buckle. Elias was beside her in an instant. He said nothing. He simply stepped in close, into her space. The heat from his body was a solid thing. He smelled of smoke and sweat. He reached up and untied the kerchief from around his neck. It was dark, soaked with his own sweat. He gently took her right hand. His touch was calloused and impossibly gentle. Maeve flinched, a small hiss of pain escaping her. "Hold still," he murmured. He wrapped the damp, cool cloth around her blistered palm, his movements careful and practiced. He then took her other hand, pressing the remaining cloth over the broken skin. She stood there, trembling, allowing the stranger to tend to her. Their eyes met in the pulsing, ruined light of the fire. He saw the fury behind her pain. She saw the steady, quiet promise in his gaze. It was a moment suspended in time, an alliance forged in ash. The sound of Kincaid's horse broke the spell. The sheriff rode up, his face grim, saw the glow from town. Copper spur. "They were gone before I got out here," Maeve said, her voice a harsh rasp. Elias stepped back, giving her space. Kincaid cursed. "Proving that'll be impossible. Silas doesn't leave tracks. This and that contract. He means to have this land, Mrs. Hollis." He gestured to her wrapped hands. "You need a doctor. I need a lawyer." Maeve corrected him. Kincaid sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You do. That paper from Tolliver is ironclad on its face. You'll need someone good, someone from Santa Fe, not some local cheat." Maeve gave a short, bitter laugh. "And how do I pay for a Santa Fe lawyer? Sheriff with Ash, I've got 6 head of bony cattle in a burned field." Kincaid had no answer. He looked at Elias and the other men. "Appreciate you neighbors helping out. See you at sunup. Mrs. Hollis, do what you can for those hands." He turned his horse and rode back toward the sleeping town. Elias and the others kicked dirt over the last of the embers. "We'll be at the hearing," Nico Alvarez said, his voice kind. "We'll tell the judge what we saw." Elias just nodded, his gray eyes holding Maeve's for a moment longer before he mounted his mule and led the men away. She was alone. The sky was turning a faint, sick gray in the east. She walked back to the cabin, the rank smell of the fire clinging to her clothes. Elias's kerchief was a damp, personal weight around her hand. She entered the small, quiet house. It smelled of her father, of old wood and coffee. Her gaze fell on the one thing of value in the room. In the corner, on a wooden stand, sat her father's saddle. It was a Visalia, with intricate, hand-tooled leather flowers and shining silver conchos. It was not a work saddle. It was a dream. Her father had always talked of riding it to California, of seeing the great ocean. He had died mending a fence on the north pasture, never having seen anything but dirt and sky. Maeve walked to it. She touched the cool, smooth leather, her bandaged hand coming away smeared with blood. A Santa Fe lawyer, filing fees to counter Silas's claim, seed for the spring, now that her feed was gone, her father's dream, or her survival. The choice was no choice at all. She gripped the heavy saddle horn. Her burned hand screamed, a sharp, clean agony that cut through the exhaustion. She lifted the saddle from its stand, its weight a heavy burden, and carried it to the door, ready for the morning's ride. She would sell the past to pay for the future. The sale of the Visalia saddle felt like cutting off a limb to save the body. It fetched $40 in Visalia, a fraction of its worth, but enough. Maeve paid the filing fee to contest the water contract, deposited the rest with the town clerk, not Tolliver, and rode back to Cedar Gulch with a receipt, a bag of seed, and hands that felt hollow. The judge had given her time, but it was a cruel joke. Silas's pipeline work had already begun. A crew of rough-looking men, not from Juniper Flats, were digging a trench across her south pasture, following the survey stakes. They were insolent, leaving gates open and spooking her cattle. Silas was complying with the improvement clause of his fraudulent contract, establishing his rights by force of iron. Maeve watched them from a distance for 2 days. On the third day, she rode out. The crew was gone, leaving a fresh scar in the earth and a stack of new 8-inch iron pipe next to the trench. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the raw dirt. She ran her gloved hand over the black pipe. It was cold, permanent. Then she saw the fittings. The iron straps used to join the sections were not factory-made. They were crude, heavy, beaten into shape at a forge, and on each one, struck deep into the metal, was a hammer mark. It was not a signature, just a flaw, a specific, oblong dent in the face of the hammer used to shape the glowing iron. Maeve's breath snagged. She knew that mark. She had seen it 2 years ago, before she married Silas, when her father's horse threw a shoe near the Arizona line. The only smithy for 30 miles was at Bitterwash, a dry, rocky canyon that served as a way station. The smith, a sullen man with one eye, had done a fast, rough job, and his hammer had left that same identical, oblong dent in the hot shoe. Bitterwash. The place was notorious. It was the unofficial bank, armory, and hospital for the Copper Spur boys. The pipe was the first thread. She needed to haul wood, timber to repair the section of the barn the fire had scorched, but her father's wagon was broken. One wheel split. She had the cattle, but no draft horse, no wagon. Elias Rook appeared that afternoon, leading a heavy-shouldered chestnut draft horse hitched to a sturdy freight wagon. He pulled up to her cabin, the wagon wheels creaking. "Saw you needed to haul," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Maeve looked at the horse, at the wagon. Both were well kept. "This isn't yours. Borrowed it from Nico Alvarez." Elias began unhitching the horse, leading it toward her trough. "He's letting me use it for a spell." Maeve knew Nico. He was a good man, but a hard one. He didn't lend. "What spell?" she asked, her voice quiet. Elias didn't look at her. He checked the horse's hoof. "He's short-handed for his fall roundup. I'm trading him a week's work. Seemed fair." A week's work. During roundup, that was 7 days, sun up to sundown. In the thickest dust and meanest cattle, it was a brutal price. He was paying with his own body for her to have the use of a wagon. "Elias," she started, but she didn't know what to say. "Thank you" was too small. "I can't accept" was a lie, because she had to. He turned, and his gray eyes met hers. "The wood won't haul itself. Maeve." He used her first name, and the sound of it, quiet and steady, settled the argument. The next morning, she drove the wagon to town. She left the timber order at the lumber yard and walked to the bank. Abner Tolliver's bank was the only brick building on the street. Inside, It was cool and dark, smelling of polished mahogany, cigar smoke, and the clean, dry scent of money. Tolliver himself was a man who matched the room. He wore a starched collar, a silk vest, and a thin, benevolent smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, feigning surprise. "How may I be of service? I trust your situation at the ranch is resolving. I'm here to review the water contract," Maeve said, her voice flat. She held out the copy the judge had given her. "I'm unclear on the fee structure." Tolliver's smile tightened. "It's quite standard. A base rate for access, plus, of course, the fees for security and maintenance of the pipeline. It is a significant investment, after all." "Security fees," Maeve repeated, holding his gaze. "That seems an unreasonable cost to place on me, since I never agreed to the pipeline." "Ah, but the territory requires such infrastructure to be protected," Tolliver said smoothly. He turned, pulling a large, leather-bound ledger from the shelf behind him. "We are simply following protocol. The bank pays the protection fee, and that cost is, naturally, passed to the beneficiary of the service." He opened the ledger, running a manicured finger down a page of neat copperplate script. He was looking for his copy of the contract, but the ledger lay open on the counter. Maeve's eyes scanned the page. It was a simple accounts payable ledger. Payments for stationery, for a new window pane, for lamp oil, and then an entry dated just 2 days ago. Security maintenance, C's freight, $50. C.S. freight, C.S. copper spur. The thread was now a rope. Tolliver found his document and turned back, his professional smile firmly in place. "As you can see," he was interrupted by the jingle of the door. A cattle baron from the south end of the county entered, and Tolliver's attention shifted immediately to the wealthier client. "Mr. Donahue." "A pleasure." Maeve folded her copy of the contract. She had her answer. She turned and walked out, the banker's slick voice fading behind her. That evening, Elias did not go back to his draw. He went to the Starlight Saloon. It was the other bank in town, the one that traded in rumors and desperation. He bought a small beer with a nickel he's had in his pocket for a month and took a stool in the darkest corner. He nursed the beer, made it last. He was just another tired ranchero, invisible, listening. For an hour, he heard nothing but complaints about the price of beef and the lack of rain. Then, 2 men sat at the bar, freight drivers by their dusty coats. They were loud, their voices thick with whiskey and grievance. "Heard they closed the Coyote Wash Trail?" The first one said. "Closed it," the other scoffed. "The Copper Spur boys just took it. Told us to find another route. Said they was moving priority goods through tomorrow night. New moon." "Goods? What goods? They ain't a freight line." The first man leaned in, his voice dropping, but not enough. "The kind of goods that move, you idiot. Word is, it's a big herd, wearing a fresh brand, heading for the railroad spur at Socorro. They're getting bold." Elias drained his beer, the last of it warm and flat. He placed the mug on the bar and walked out, melting back into the shadows. He met Maeve at Cedar Gulch. The moon was just a sliver, offering no light. She was waiting on the porch, having unloaded the last of the timber. They spoke in low voices in the darkness. "The pipe fittings," she said. "They're from Bitter Wash, the bank ledger." He replied. "It shows payments to Cebes Freight, $50. Copper Spur," she breathed. "They're his security. He's paying them to be on my land, and he's paying them with beef," Elias said. "They're moving a herd tomorrow night, through Coyote Wash." They were silent, the pieces clicking together with the cold, hard sound of a cell door locking. "It's not just the water," Maeve said, thinking aloud. "The connections forming. It was never just the water. He's using the pipeline to establish a presence. He's paying the Copper Spur boys to run me off, to burn my hay, to make me fail. He wants me desperate, so I'll sell cheap. And he's paying his army with stolen cattle," Elias finished. "Yours, most likely." Maeve stood up. The quiet investigation was over. "I'm going to Red Butte. Maeve, no, it's too dark. It's where he holds them, she said, her voice devoid of fear, replaced by a cold certainty. It's the only set of corrals between here and the wash. I'm going to see my father's brand. Then I'm going with you. They saddled her horse and his mule, riding without lanterns, trusting the animals to see the trail. The Red Butte corrals were 3 miles north, tucked into a box canyon, invisible from the main track. They dismounted a quarter-mile out, tying the animals in a stand of mesquite. They moved the rest of the way on foot, like ghosts, Elias in the lead. The canyon amplified the small sounds, the restless stamp of a hoof, the lowing of a calf. A small fire burned near a lean-to, but the single man guarding it was asleep, a bottle by his side. They slipped past him, climbing the rough cedar rails of the main corral. The enclosure was full, at least 50 head of cattle, shadows moving against shadows. Maeve's eyes adjusted. She could make out the shapes, the brands. She saw a few from neighboring ranches. And then she saw hers, a young heifer, one she had raised by hand. The brand was on its left flank. It should have been a simple, blocky H, her father's Hollis brand. But it was not. It was an H with a diagonal slash running from the top right to the bottom right. H/. A simple, clever alteration, done with a running iron, changing the brand just enough to make it unrecognizable, to claim it as Silas's merit stock. She pointed, her hands shaking with rage. Elias nodded. He had seen it too. They backed away, silent as they had come, retrieving their animals and riding hard for the safety of Cedar Gulch. Back in her cabin, the kerosene lamp cast long, dancing shadows. "We go to Kincaid," Elias said, his voice firm. "Now. This is rustling. This is the proof he needs." "Proof," Maeve's voice was bitter. "A brand he has to ride 3 miles in the dark to see a herd that will be in Coyote Wash by sunup. And in Socorro by the next day, that guard will wake. The cattle will be gone. It will be my word against Silas Merritt's." She paced the small room, her hands clenched. "No, we need living proof. We need one of them here." Elias looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Maeve, that's rustling. Taking a cow from his corral, regardless of the brand. That's a hanging offense." "It's my cow," she spat. "And he altered the brand. I'm just correcting it." She went to the small smithy attached to the barn, Elias following. She found her father's iron, the simple H. "We ride back," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "We cut one out, and we fix the brand. Maeve, a hot brand. The smoke, the smell. Not hot," she said. "Cold, a cold brand." Elias knew what she meant. A running iron, heated not to glowing red, but to a black heat. Hot enough to singe the hair and change the H/ back to an H, but not hot enough to burn the hide or send up a plume of smoke. It was difficult, dangerous work. "It's a new moon," she said. "There's no light. We can do it." The plan was insane. It was a desperate, foolish risk. "I'll need you to hold her," Maeve said, gripping the heavy, cold iron. Elias looked at her, at the raw determination in her face, the fire that burned hotter than her burned-out haystack. He stepped forward, his hand closing over hers on the long, cold shaft of the branding iron. Their hands were together on the iron. The metal was frigid from the night air. Outside, the wind picked up, and their breath, close together, fogged in the darkness of the smithy. It was a shared, desperate gamble. A spark of absolute trust passed between them, heavier and more binding than any vow. "Get the rope," Elias said. "We'll take the quietest one." From a high ridge, 100 yards away, a shadow detached itself from a cluster of pinon pine. A man, Silas's man, the same one who had been asleep, had been following them. He had seen them ride to the corrals. He had seen them ride back. And he had just watched them, through a small spyglass, as they stood together in the smithy, holding the branding iron. He smiled, a cold, thin expression in the dark. He lowered the glass, slipped silently to his horse, and rode fast toward Juniper Flats. Not to the corrals, to Silas. The plan to take the cow died the moment it was born. They both knew it. The risk was too great, the gain too small. The man on the ridge had seen them. The alarm was already raised. "He's not moving the herd," Elias said, his voice low in the darkness of the smithy. "Not now. He knows we're onto him. He'll scatter them." "So, the brand is useless," Maeve said, the iron heavy in her hand. The cold certainty of her anger was beginning to crack, admitting the chill of failure. "No," Elias said. He let go of the brand and pointed to the wagon. "The pipe, the fittings. We can't get to Massilia by sunup," Maeve countered. "Silas will have the main road watched, his C.S. Freight boys will be waiting." "Not the main road," Elias said, his gaze turning to the north. "Coyote Wash. It's a hard trek, but it cuts 20 miles off the ride. We can make it." It was a terrible choice. Coyote Wash was a dry, winding canyon, a natural trap, but it was the only choice. They hitched the nervous draft horse to Nico Alvarez's freight wagon. Maeve found the specific 8-inch pipe fitting with the oblong hammer mark from Bitter Wash. It was heavy, a 50-pound piece of evidence. She loaded it into the wagon bed, along with her father's forge tools, a hammer, tongs, a small anvil as a cover story, in case they were stopped by anyone other than Silas. Maeve climbed onto the wagon seat, taking the thick leather reins. Elias mounted his mule. He would ride scout, half a mile ahead. They set off, not toward the road, but across the open plain, the wagon wheels groaning in the sand. The moon was a bare sliver, and the stars were blotted out by a low, fast-moving ceiling of cloud. The air, which had promised rain, now held its breath. An hour before dawn, they dropped into the mouth of Coyote Wash. The high, rocky walls rose on either side, enclosing them in a deeper darkness. And then the sky tore open. It was not rain, it was hail. It came with a sound like 1,000 windows shattering, a roar that filled the canyon. Ice the size of marbles, then the size of bullets, hammered the wagon's canvas cover, stinging Maeve's face and hands. The draft horse screamed, rearing in the traces. "Hold him!" Elias yelled, riding back, his mule spinning in panic. "Keep him moving!" The ground, a dry, baked adobe, became a sheet of slick, greasy mud in seconds. The heavy wagon slid, its rear wheels threatening to slip into the deep gully that ran down the center of the wash. Maeve fought the reins, her raw hands screaming as she tried to keep the terrified horse on its feet. "This way!" Elias shouted, grabbing the horse's bridle, forcing it forward. "The wash is a flood trap." That was when the shots rang out. Ping, whump. Lead striking rock and the heavy timber of the wagon bed. High on the rim, silhouetted against the sickly gray dawn, were 5 riders, copper spur. They had been waiting. The spy on the ridge had done his work. "They're driving us," Elias yelled over the hail. "They want us in the gully. Keep to the wall." Another shot kicked up mud just ahead of the horse. Maeve hauled on the reins. The horse slipped, going down on one knee. "Go to the right," Elias roared. He was off his mule, lashing the draft horse's flank with the end of his rope. There, needle cut. Maeve looked. It was madness. A dark fissure in the canyon wall. A crack barely wider than the wagon itself. It looked like a dead end. "Go!" She snapped the reins. The horse found its feet and lunged, desperation giving it strength. The wagon slammed into the mouth of the fissure, a sound of splintering wood as the axle scraped stone, but it held. They were in. They plunged into the narrow cut, the hail lessening as the high rock walls protected them. The cut opened into a small, sandy bowl, no bigger than a corral. It was a perfect box canyon, a perfect trap. The copper spur riders appeared at the mouth of the cut, rifles raised, laughing. They had them. Then, a new rider pushed through them. Silas Merritt. He was not masked. His face was slick with ice and rain, his eyes burning with a triumphant rage. He held up his hand. The riders lowered their rifles. Silas dismounted and walked slowly into the cut, the sound of his spurs deadened by the mud. He stopped a safe distance away, just out of revolver range. Elias stood beside the wagon, his own rifle held ready, its muzzle pointed at the ground. Well, Maeve, Silas called out, his voice unfazed by the storm. This is a lot of trouble over a piece of scrap iron. He gestured to the pipe fitting in the wagon bed. I see you brought your father's tools. Planning on starting your own pipeline? We're taking this to the judge, Maeve said. Her voice was steady, but her hands, gripping the reins, were shaking so hard the leather creaked. I don't think you are, Silas said, stepping closer. This is a simple thing. You are on my claim, attempting to steal my property. These men are my security, hired by the bank, as you well know. They're just doing their job. Burning hay is not a job, Elias said, his voice a low growl. It's a crime. Silas's eyes flicked to him. Rook, you are a persistent insect, but I am a reasonable man. He looked back at Maeve, forcing a smile that was all teeth. I am going to make you an offer. A final one. He stepped closer still. Sign the quitclaim deed to Cedar Gulch. Just sign the paper. I'll tear up Tolliver's contract. I'll forget the debts. I will give you $500. Cash. You and him. He nodded at Elias. Can ride out, go to Arizona, go to California, like your crazy old man always wanted. Just go, I get the land, you get your life. That's peace. Maeve stared at him. She saw the man she had married, the man whose charm was just a tool to get what he wanted, and whose violence was the tool he used when charm failed. She saw the shadow of the woman she had been, the one who had been afraid of him. She let the reins drop. She stood up on the wagon seat, towering over him. The hail had softened to a cold, sleeting rain. Peace, she said. Her voice was clear, ringing off the stone walls. You offer me $500 for my father's land and call it peace. Peace bought with slavery. Silas is just war in a flat cap. The smile vanished from Silas's face. Wrong answer, Maeve. He raised his hand, signaling his men. A new sound drowned him out, a low, guttural roar, like a train, coming from up the main wash. Elias, who lived by the moods of the earth, knew it instantly. The hail, he breathed. Up canyon, it's the runoff. He looked at the mouth of the cut, his eyes wide with a new terror. Flash flood, even as he said it, a wall of brown, churning water, 6 feet high and filled with broken trees and ice, surged past the mouth of Needle Cut. It filled the main wash, bank to bank. In less than 10 seconds, Silas screamed and scrambled for his horse. The Copper Spur men, caught on the low ground, were yelling, their horses rearing as the water licked at the trail. We have to get out of the wash, Elias yelled. The cut will flood next. Get us out. Maeve didn't hesitate. She grabbed the reins and the whip, lashing the terrified horse. Get up here. The horse lunged, pulling the wagon, which slid and crashed back out of the fissure, its wheels finding purchase just as the secondary surge of water began to pour into the cut they had just left. They were on the main trail, but the water was rising, a furious, muddy river. The bridge, Maeve shouted, her voice thin with panic. We have to make Mormon Bridge. They raced the flood, the heavy wagon careening through the slick mud and rising water. The horse, smelling death, ran with a wild energy. Behind them, they heard the shouts of Silas and his men, also fleeing the rising tide. They rounded the last bend. The crossing was ahead. It was gone. Mormon Bridge, a simple cottonwood span, had been swept away. All that remained were the 2 thick central pilings, standing like broken teeth in the middle of a 20-yard-wide torrent of churning, debris-filled water. On the far bank, 3 of the Copper Spur riders, who had been on the high ground, sat on their horses, watching, trapped on their side. Silas and the other 2 pulled up on the bank near Maeve. Cut off! Stuck, Maeve whispered, the fight draining out of her. They were safe, but they were trapped. Elias was already in the back of the wagon, pulling at the thick coil of rope he'd brought. No, we're not. He jumped to the ground, the water already swirling around his knees. He tied one end of the rope, fast and secure, to the wagon's solid front axle. He ran to the front, handing the spool to Maeve. Let it feed out, he commanded. Don't let it snag, but don't let it pull you. Elias, what are you? No. She saw his intention. You'll never make it. It's freezing. It's the only way. Maeve. He pulled his knife from his belt and wedged it deep, securing it. He looked at the water, then at her. His gray eyes were calm, resolute. Hold the line. Before she could argue, he plunged into the flood. The current snatched him, pulling him under. Maeve screamed. She paid out the rope, her hands burning, watching the dark line snake out into the brown chaos. He surfaced 10 yards downstream, sputtering, fighting the current, angling his body desperately toward the far piling. A broken fence post surged past, missing his head by inches. He went under again. The rope went slack. Elias! It jerked taut, nearly pulling her from the wagon seat. He was up, clinging to the far piling, his body plastered against it by the force of the water. He was alive. She watched, her heart in her throat, as he fought the current with one hand, clinging with the other, to get the rope looped around the thick, slick cottonwood. He did it. He cinched the knot. He turned and, holding the rope, waved a single, triumphant arm. He pulled himself back along the rope, hand over hand, fighting the torrent. He reached the bank, collapsing next to the wagon, his chest heaving. The horse! He gasped, spitting muddy water. Tie it to the harness. We'll swim him across, and he'll pull the wagon with... It was a brutal, terrifying crossing. Elias, his body already stiffening with cold, waded back in, holding the horse's bridle, while Maeve, on the wagon, urged it forward. The animal screamed as the cold water hit its belly, but it swam, its powerful muscles driving against the current. The wagon followed, lurching into the river, the rope groaning as it took the full, terrible strain. The wagon bed filled with water, the precious tools and the iron fittings submerged. The wagon tilted, threatening to capsize, but the rope held. The horse found the far bank, scrambling up the slick mud, and pulled the wagon clear. Elias was last, still clinging to the line, his strength gone. Maeve dropped the reins and ran to the edge of the collapsing bank. The mud sucked at her boots. She lay flat on her stomach, her arm outstretched. Elias, take my hand. He reached up. His hand was blue, numb. She grabbed his wrist. His grip was weak. She locked her own, her other hand digging into the mud for purchase. Pull, he gasped. She leaned back, her muscles screaming, her raw hands tearing, pulling him from the flood's grip. He came sliding up the bank, collapsing in a heap, water and mud pouring from his clothes. Maeve fell beside him, her chest aching, her breath coming in sobs. Her entire body was shaking. Her hands were shredded, bleeding freely, but her eyes, when they met his, were as steady as the iron piling that had saved them. A high, thin whistle cut the air. They both looked up, across the flood, on the far ridge. Silas and his men had regrouped. They were trapped, but they were watching. One of the copper spur men, angry at the lost fight, raised his rifle. Elias moved, a blur of motion. He scrambled to the wagon, grabbed his rifle, and ejected the soaked cartridge. He slammed a fresh one in from his belt. He fired before the other man could. The shot was not aimed to kill. It sang off a rock, a foot above the man's head, the ricochet echoing down the canyon. The man ducked, pulling his horse back. Don't kill him, Maeve panted, pulling herself to her knees. I'm not, Elias said, chambering another round, his teeth chattering from the cold. He kept the rifle level. We need them alive. They're witnesses now. They all saw Silas try to kill us. The riders on the far side looked at each other. They looked at Silas. The fight was over. Cut off by the flood, they were useless. One by one, they turned their horses and rode away, disappearing over the ridge. Only Silas remained. He sat his bay horse, staring at them across the roaring, muddy water. His face was a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. He was too far to be hurt easily, but he cupped his hands to his mouth and screamed, his voice tearing and faint over the sound of the flood. This changes nothing. Nothing. You'll be empty-handed in court. Maeve, you hear me? Empty-handed. Maeve stood. She was covered in mud. Her hair was a matted tangle. Her hands were dripping blood onto the wet earth. She cupped her own hands to her mouth, and her voice, clear and cold as the hail, cut across the water. I'm not coming to ask. Silas, I'm coming to demand. He stared at her for a long second, then wrenched his horse's head around and galloped away, his defeat lost in the sound of the storm. Silence fell, heavy and wet. There was only the roar of the flood and the hiss of the rain. Elias looked down at his arm. A piece of driftwood had torn his sleeve, leaving a long, shallow gash that was bleeding sluggishly. Maeve saw it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely move, but she ripped a clean strip of cloth from the hem of her petticoat. Wordlessly, she knelt in the mud and began to wrap his arm. They sat there, two small figures on a vast, ruined hillside, the wagon safe behind them. Above them, the last of the thunder rumbled, a low, defeated sound, as it moved east. The ride back from Coyote Wash was a silent, gray eternity. The flood had raged for hours, then, having spent its fury, receded with a sucking, greedy sound. By midnight, the wash was a graveyard of black mud and shattered trees. They led the exhausted draft horse and Elias's mule through the devastation, the wagon's wheels sinking, every foot of progress a victory. They reached Cedar Gulch as the first, bruised light of dawn touched the mesas. The cabin was still. The scorched patch on the barn was a dark, accusing eye. They were caked in mud, their bodies stiff with cold and exhaustion, their wounds throbbing in the frigid air. There was no thought of sleep. It was a kind of madness, the need to restore one small piece of a broken world, instead of collapsing. They unhitched the horse and walked, as if summoned, to the south pasture fence line. It was the same fence where Silas had found them. The few posts they had set still stood, but the rest of the line was a sagging, rotted mess. Elias took the heavy post-hole digger. Maeve, moving like a woman in a dream, fetched the last of her father's cedar posts. They began to work. He did not speak. She did not speak. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the digger biting into the damp earth, and the sh-thump as Maeve cleared the old holes. They set the new posts, the sweet, sharp scent of cedar cutting through the smell of mud and ash. They were reclaiming the line, foot by foot. Elias took his stretching tool from the wagon. He looped the wire, braced his boot, and pulled. The barbed wire sang, a high, thin note in the cold air, snapping taut. They fastened it to the new posts, their movements economical, practiced. They were no longer two strangers, they were a team, bound by the shared memory of the flood. When the last wire was stapled fast, the sun was a pale, watery disk above the horizon. The fence was whole. It ran straight and true, gleaming wetly in the new light, a defiant scar drawn against the chaos. They walked back to the cabin. Maeve's hands, wrapped in the torn, bloody strips of her petticoat, were stiff claws. Elias's sleeve was dark where the gash had bled. Inside, Maeve worked the pump handle, her shoulders aching. She built a small fire in the cook stove, the crackle of the kindling painfully loud. She ground the last of her coffee beans, the aroma filling the cold room. When the water boiled, she poured it into the only 2 cups she owned. They were her mother's, a porcelain set, white with a faded blue flower. Both were chipped. She handed one to Elias. He took it, his large, mud-caked hand almost swallowing the delicate cup. He held it carefully, his fingers wrapped around the warmth. They stood by the stove, the rising steam veiling their faces. They drank. The coffee was scalding, bitter, and it tasted like life. Their eyes met over the chipped porcelain rims. It was a shared communion, a silent acknowledgement of all that had passed and all that was to come. He nodded, a gesture of thanks, and set the cup down. The animals, outside, they tended to the exhausted draft horse and the mule, checking their legs, giving them fresh water and the last of the oats. Elias turned to the wagon. It was a wreck, coated in mud, the tools scattered. He began to repack it, Securing the heavy iron pipe fitting and the forge tools for the trip to Massilia, he coiled a long rope, preparing to tie a load hitch. Maeve watched, her own hands throbbing uselessly at her sides. "You should know this one," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "A diamond hitch. It will hold a load even if one rope breaks. It balances the weight." He took a shorter, spare rope and began to demonstrate, his movements quick and sure. "You make the loop, so, over, and then under itself." He glanced at her, motioning for her to try. Maeve fumbled, her bandaged fingers clumsy, the rope refusing to obey. A flare of frustration, hot and sharp, brought tears to her eyes. Elias stopped her, his voice softening. "You're fighting it. Let the rope do the work." He gently took her left wrist. Turning her hand, his touch was light, calloused, guiding her fingers. He unwound the knot she had tangled. "You just guide it," he murmured. "The strength is not in pulling, Maeve. It's in knowing when to let go, when to let the knot take the strain." He looked at her, and she knew he was not talking about the rope. His thumb brushed the pulse at her wrist. She held her breath. A deep, slow warmth spread up her arm, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weak sun. She guided the rope as he showed her. The knot formed, clean and perfect. It held. He let her go and turned back to the wagon. The sun, gaining strength, began to burn through the morning mist. The air was cleaner, the smell of the flood receding. Maeve looked at the scorched patch on the barn roof, the black, gaping hole where the fire had eaten at the eaves. "The roof," she said. An hour later, Elias was balanced on the rafters, prying away the charred shingles with a crowbar. Maeve, on the ground, sorted through the timbers she had hauled, selecting the straightest, strongest planks. She passed them up to him, her arms straining. The sound of his hammer, sharp and clear, echoed across the ranch. Bang, bang, bang. It was not the sound of digging graves or stretching wire. It was the sound of rebuilding. Their clothes, stiff with dried mud, steamed in the sun. Maeve took his patched coat and her own wool jacket, the ones they had worn through the flood, and hung them on the new fence line, like flags of surrender. The sun beat down, washing away the smell of fear, the scent of the river bottom. Just before noon, a buckboard rattled up the track. Maeve tensed, her hand dropping to her belt, but it was only Lottie Finch, the town seamstress. A small, sharp-eyed woman pulled her mule to a stop. Lottie's gaze was quick, taking in everything: the mended fence, Elias on the roof, the drying coats, the loaded wagon. "Maeve," she said, her voice brisk. She held out a brown paper parcel. "I finished that jacket you left." Maeve came forward, wiping her hands on her trousers. "Lottie, I'm grateful. I don't have the coin for it right now. I'll put it on your account," Lottie said, dismissing the debt. She looked at Maeve's bandaged hands, then up at Elias. She lowered her voice. "The whole town knows. Kincaid told us about the flood. Silas is telling everyone you tried to steal his equipment and got caught by the storm." Maeve's jaw tightened. "Listen to me," Lottie said, leaning in. "I've seen Judge Hollander work for 10 years. He's a hard man. He doesn't like stubborn women, Maeve, and he doesn't like scandal, but he respects evidence. Hard evidence." "I have it," Maeve said. She went into the cabin. When she returned, she carried a thick manila envelope, sealed with wax. "Lottie, I need to ask you a favor. A dangerous one." Lottie's bright eyes did not waver. "Elias and I are riding to Massilia. We're taking the wagon. Silas will know. He'll be watching the roads." "Maeve, that's suicide," Lottie whispered. "It's the only way. This." Maeve held up the envelope. "Is my insurance. If we don't make it, if Kincaid doesn't hear from us by sundown tomorrow." Lottie's face went pale, but she nodded. "Inside," Maeve continued, her voice low and precise, "is a drawing I made of my father's brand, and a sketch of how Silas's men altered it at Red Butte. There's a copy I made of the page I saw in Tolliver's ledger, the one showing the payment to Sia's Freight, and there's my sworn statement, my affidavit, about the bitter wash hammer mark on the pipe fitting." She pressed the heavy envelope into Lottie's hand. "You keep this. You hide it. If we don't come back, you give this to Sheriff Kincaid, only to him. Do you understand?" Lottie Finch looked from Maeve's desperate, determined face to the man on the roof, who had paused, hammer in hand, watching them. She saw the shared resolve. She nodded, her thin lips set in a tight line. She tucked the envelope deep into the pocket of her dress. "Godspeed, Maeve, and be smarter than he is." Lottie snapped the reins, her buckboard turning in a tight, fast circle, and rattled back toward town. Elias climbed down from the roof. The patch was finished, a pale, new square against the weathered wood. He walked past Maeve, over to the new fence line. He picked up a piece of cedar shingle, left from the roof repair. He took his knife from his belt. Maeve watched as he sat on his heels, his back to her, and began to carve. His hands, calloused and scarred, moved with a surprising, steady grace. The small blade flashed. When he was finished, he stood. He walked to the main gatepost, the one nearest the track. He nailed the small piece of wood to it, the hammer blows echoing the sound from the roof. She walked over to read it. 2 words, cut deep and clear into the red wood. "Stay true." She looked at the words, then at him. He was looking at the fence, at the way it ran toward the horizon. "A fence has to," he said, as if explaining the obvious. "Or it's just wire." The day began to die. The afternoon faded, and the wind, which had been clean, turned cold. From town, over a mile away, the wind carried a new sound. Someone at the Starlight Saloon was playing a banjo. The tune was fast, a reel, but the distance made it sound thin and hollow. Then a voice, singing. The words were blurred, but the cadence was that of a new song. Maeve flushed, realizing they were already becoming a story, a piece of frontier gossip, a song about a flood, a fence, and the woman who built it with will. The sun dipped, and the air turned sharp, promising frost. They sat on the cabin's porch step, side by side. They were too exhausted to eat, too tense to sleep. The hearing was hours away. Maeve went inside and returned with the last heel of her cornbread. It was dry and hard. She broke it in 2, the pieces uneven, and handed the larger one to Elias. They ate in silence, the dry crumbs coarse in their mouths. It was not a meal. It was a shared vow. The first true wind of autumn swept down from the mountains, a sudden, cold rush that rattled the dry leaves of the cottonwood. Maeve shivered violently, her thin shirt no match for the sudden cold. Elias stood. He went not to his mule, but to the wagon. He untied his bedroll. From it, he pulled a clean kerchief, dark blue wool, thick and soft. It was not the one he had given her for her hands. That one was ruined, stained with blood and ash. This one was clean. He came back. He stepped behind her, where she sat on the top step. Maeve froze. He didn't hand it to her. He unfolded it, gently, wordlessly. He draped the warm wool over her shoulders. The cloth smelled of him, of cedar and clean dust. As he settled it around her neck, his hand brushed the bare skin of her nape, just below her hair. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was a shock, a sudden, quiet fire. It was not the brief, functional touch of the glove, not the instructive touch of the knot tying. This was a deliberate, lingering touch. It was warm. She felt his hand tremble. Just once, a betraying tremor. He let his fingers rest there for a single, suspended heartbeat. A moment of profound, unspoken contact that acknowledged everything. The fence, the fire, the flood. Then, just as slowly, he withdrew his hand. He sat down beside her on the step, a foot of respectful space between them. He stared out into the vast, cold darkness. They sat for a long time, the silence broken only by the wind. The blue kerchief was a heavy, comforting weight on her shoulders. The hearing, Silas, the court, it all waited in the darkness. But on the porch, for this one night, there was a different kind of truce. The cold was a blade. It cut through the wool of the kerchief, through her thin cotton shirt, slicing straight to the bone. The wind had stopped being a voice and had become a physical, shoving force. Maeve shivered, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that racked her whole body. Elias saw it. He stood up from the porch step, his movement stiff. The wind tore at his patched coat. He did not offer a hand. He just waited. A question. She stood, pulling the blue wool tighter around her neck. The warmth of the cabin, the small, safe box her father had built, was a desperate need. She nodded, a short, sharp gesture. They moved as one, turning from the vast, screaming dark and stepping into the quiet. The silence inside was a shock. It was heavy, thick, pressing in on them. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of the first hard drops of rain. A dry, dusty rain, hitting the tin roof. The cabin was cold. The fire in the cook stove had burned down to a bed of sullen red embers. While Elias stood by the door, a dark shape against the dark wood. Maeve moved to the stove. She added 2 split logs of piñón. The wood was dry, and it caught quickly. The embers flared, and a moment later, a bright, hungry crackle filled the room. A wave of radiant golden red light washed over the pine walls, over the simple cot, over the table. It painted them both in warmth. Maeve turned. She looked at the door, at the man standing beside it. The world was out there, Silas. The copper spur, the flood, the court. She stepped to the door. Her hands, bandaged and stiff, were clumsy as she grasped the heavy 4x4 wooden bar. Elias watched her. He did not move. He did not help. This was her action. She lifted the bar and slid it, with a heavy, scraping thud, into the thick iron brackets. The sound was final, an absolute. It locked the world out, and it locked them in. She let out a breath she had been holding since the flood. She turned to face him. He was just standing there, his hands loose at his sides. The firelight caught the planes of his face, casting deep shadows under his cheekbones. His shirt, still damp from the river, clung to his shoulders and back. In the small, enclosed space, the air was suddenly close. She could see the faint fog of his breath mixing with hers in the warm air from the stove. The firelight caught something else. The long, shallow gash on his cheekbone, the one from the driftwood, had seeped. A thin, dark line of blood traced a path to his jaw. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice was too loud in the quiet. He touched his cheek, his fingers coming away dark. He seemed surprised, as if he had forgotten it was there. Maeve moved without thinking. She took the small kettle from the stove, poured a splash of hot water into a tin basin, and dipped the edge of a clean flour sack cloth into it. She wrung it out. She stepped in front of him. He was taller than she'd realized. She had to look up. She could smell the cold river mud on his skin, the scent of ozone from the storm, and the clean, sharp smell of the cedar he had been carving. "Hold still," she murmured. She lifted the warm, damp cloth. She was only meaning to tend the wound, a simple act of nursing. But as she touched the cloth to his skin, the world narrowed. Her fingers, wrapped in the cloth, were gentle. He did not flinch. He just watched her. His gray eyes, inches from hers, were not calm now. They were dark, the pupils wide, reflecting the fire. She finished cleaning the cut. Her hand, holding the cloth, hovered for a moment, suspended in the space between them. He caught her wrist. His grip was not violent. It was not even tight. It was a simple, absolute capture. Her hand, holding the cloth, was frozen. His skin was rough, calloused, but we're not just 2 people in a room. We're the only 2 people. Her breath stopped. The pulse in her wrist, trapped beneath his thumb, hammered a frantic, desperate beat. Thump, 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 thump. He held her gaze. He was not a man of many words, and he used none now. His eyes asked the question. They asked for permission. They acknowledged the bar on the door, the shared fire, the fence, the flood. They asked if this was the next step. She did not pull away. She did not breathe. She let her eyes give the answer. He leaned in. It was the slowest movement she had ever seen, a lifetime passing in the inches between them. He gave her every chance to turn, to refuse. She did not move. She met him, tilting her chin up. The first touch of his lips was not a kiss. It was a question, chapped, dry, hesitant. It was the touch of a man who had forgotten how. Then, as she let out her captured breath, his lips softened. The kiss deepened. It was slow. It was sure. It was like the ranch knot he had shown her, a deliberate, careful binding. It was not a kiss of reckless passion, but of anchoring. It was not a taking. It was a promise. It was the first safe thing she had felt in 2 years. The tick-tick-tick of the rain on the roof grew louder, a steady, rhythmic chorus. The wind howled outside the walls, a distant, defeated sound. The kiss broke, but they did not part. They rested their foreheads together. His hand still held her wrist. Her other hand, the one that was free, came up, pressing flat against the hard muscle of his chest. His heart was a wild thing, a trapped bird, beating as hard as her own. "Maeve," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, rough, like the sound of dry wood catching fire. Just her name. His patched coat, still damp and smelling of the river, was a rough barrier between them. Her fingers fumbled with the worn fabric, pushing it from his shoulders. He released her wrist, shrugging out of the coat. It fell to the floorboards with a soft, heavy sound. His hands went to her shoulders, finding the wool kerchief he had given her. He drew it away, his fingers brushing the skin of her neck. He tossed it to the chair. They stood in the firelight, in their thin shirts. His hands found her shoulders again, his grip firm, warm. Her hands rested on his chest. He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of deep, shared hunger, of survival, of a dam finally breaking. He backed her up, one slow step at a time, until her spine met the smooth, warm pine of the cabin wall. The wood was solid behind her, his body solid in front. The intensity of it, the heat, the sheer reality of it, was overwhelming. His hand slid from her shoulders to her waist, pulling her closer. His breathing was heavy, a ragged sound against her mouth. He broke the kiss, burying his face in the curve of her neck. She could feel his lips move against her skin, hear his ragged breathing. She wound her fingers into his hair, holding him, anchoring herself as the room seemed to tilt. He drew her away from the wall, not releasing her, but guiding her. He pulled her toward the stove, toward the heart of the warmth. He stopped, his hands resting on her hips, his gaze locked on hers. His hand, the one that had been cut, moved, slowly, deliberately. He traced the line of her ribs, up, until his knuckles brushed the soft cotton hem of her shirt. He stopped. His hand was a line of fire against her skin. He did not move. He did not ask. He just waited, his eyes dark with a fire that matched the stove, held hers. He was giving her the final choice. He would not take what was not offered. He was a man who understood fences, and this was the last, most important line. She saw the respect in that pause. She saw the truth of him. Maeve did not speak. Her answer was not a word. She lifted her own hands, her scarred, trembling fingers finding the top button of her shirt. She undid it. A single, sharp nod. That was all. She reached for him, her hands sliding around his neck, and pulled his mouth back to hers. The kiss was a collision. It was a release, just as the passion threatened to consume them. A violent gust of wind slammed the loose shutter of the bedroom window against the outside wall. Crack! The sound was as loud as a gunshot. They both jumped, breaking apart, their heads snapping toward the sound. For a second, they just stared at the rattling window, their hearts hammering. Then, a low, breathless laugh escaped Maeve. It was a sound of pure, startled relief. Elias looked at her, and a slow, genuine smile transformed his face, crinkling the corners of his gray eyes. The tension shattered, replaced by a sudden, shared joy. He rested his forehead against hers again. "Damned wind," he whispered, his own voice rough with laughter. The moment was no longer one of desperate, world-ending passion. It was something better. It was real. His smile faded, replaced by a quiet intensity. He began to unbutton his damp shirt, his eyes never leaving hers. She watched his fingers, sure and steady. He shrugged it off. His skin, in the firelight, was scored with old scars, a map of a hard life. Her own fingers, clumsy and stiff, went back to the remaining buttons on her shirt. He watched her. When she fumbled, he did not help, but waited. She pulled the shirt from her shoulders. The firelight met the pale skin of her shoulders. The cool air of the cabin met his heat as they moved together. It was a joining, not of desperation, but of deliberate, safe warmth. He reached for the single wool blanket on her cot, the one her father had used. He shook it out, and it settled over both of them, a cocoon of soft, dark wool. He drew her down, not onto the cold, narrow cot, but onto the clean-swept pine floorboards, directly in the pool of red-gold light from the stove. They lay, tangled in the blanket, their limbs finding a new language. The night closed in around the small cabin. The rain fell, a steady drumbeat on the roof, a rhythm for the two hearts that had finally found the same beat. The fire burned low, casting long, peaceful shadows. The world, for these few hours, was reduced to the smell of burning piñón, the sound of the rain, and the steady, living warmth of the person beside her. Long before dawn, the rain stopped. The cabin was filled with a deep, cold silence. Maeve stirred, the movement pulling the blanket from her shoulder. The chill woke her. She was in his arms. He was awake. He had been watching her sleep. He said nothing. He simply leaned over, his movement slow. He gathered the edge of the wool blanket and drew it up, tucking it securely around her shoulder, shielding her from the cold. It was an act of such simple, profound tenderness that it made her throat ache. He lingered, his face close to hers in the pre-dawn gloom. He leaned down and pressed his lips, not to her mouth, but to her forehead. The kiss was warm, firm, and blessedly chaste. It was not a seal on a night of passion. It was a seal on a promise. It was a love that had been forged in fire, tested in water, and now, finally, brought home. The courtroom in Massilia Crossing was built of thick adobe and heavy, dark pine, designed to absorb the heat of the day and the anger of its occupants. It smelled of dust, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acidic tang of stale chewing tobacco. A single, massive ceiling fan, powered by a belt system, squeaked in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, stirring the hot, dead air. The room was packed. This was not just a legal hearing. It was a blood sport. Ranchers, merchants, and saloon girls, all pressed together on the hard wooden benches, waiting for the show. At the front, Judge Hollander sat, a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same hard granite as the mountains. His beard was iron gray, his eyes unreadable. Silas Merritt sat at the plaintiff's table. He was washed, shaved, and wearing a clean black suit. Beside him sat his lawyer, a man named Breen, who had a slick city look and a briefcase full of sharp, paper-cut words. Abner Tolliver sat directly behind them, his face a mask of civic concern, his ledger resting on his lap. Maeve and Elias sat on the other side. They were alone. They had washed in the horse trough before dawn, but their clothes were still stained with the mud of coyote wash, their hands raw. Maeve's hair was pulled back tight, her face pale but set. Elias sat straight-backed, his rifle at his feet, his gaze fixed on the judge. "The court calls the matter of Merritt versus Hollis, regarding water rights on the Cedar Gulch claim," Hollander announced, his voice a low rumble. He banged the gavel once. The squeaking fan was the only sound. "Mr. Breen, you may begin." Breen rose, smoothing his suit. "Your Honor, this is a simple, unfortunate matter. A matter of progress. My client, Mr. Silas Merritt, a forward-thinking man, has returned to his home only to find his, estranged wife, Mrs. Hollis, has fallen prey to some rather fanciful notions about her father's land. He smiled, a thin, condescending expression. Mr. Merritt, being a man of vision, has secured the necessary bonds and contracts to bring the miracle of modern irrigation to this dry territory, an investment that will benefit the entire county. We have the contract, filed and notarized by Mr. Abner Tolliver, president of our esteemed territorial bank. It is all quite in order. He called Tolliver, who took the stand and, with practiced ease, presented the water contract. It was, as Silas had boasted, ironclad. It spoke of liens, improvement bonds, and water access fees, all signed by Silas Merritt. "And this security fee mentioned?" Breen asked. "That is standard, is it not?" "But of course," Tolliver said smoothly. "An investment of this magnitude, new pipeline, materials, it must be protected from theft or vandalism. The bank insists upon it." Breen turned to Maeve. "Mrs. Hollis, you have no counsel. Do you intend to argue against a legal, binding contract? Perhaps you simply do not understand the complexities of territorial water law. It is, I assure you, quite intricate." A few titters ran through the crowd. Silas smirked. Judge Hollander fixed his gaze on Maeve. "Mrs. Hollis, do you wish to respond?" Maeve stood. Her hands, still wrapped in strips of cloth, were steady on the table. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the heavy air. "Your Honor, I am not here to argue water law. I am here to report a crime." Breen shot to his feet. "Objection, slander. The defendant is attempting to malign my client. I will be the judge of that." Hollander rumbled. "Sit down. Mr. Breen, continue. Mrs. Hollis." "Mr. Breen is correct. I do not understand finance, but I understand iron." Maeve said, "Bailiff, I ask you to present Exhibit A." The bailiff, looking confused, helped Elias carry the heavy, mud-caked pipe fitting and place it on the floor before the judge's bench. The thud was solid, final. "This is a coupling," Maeve said. "From the pipeline Mr. Merritt is building on my land. I ask you to look closely at the hammer mark on the iron strap. It is a specific oblong mark. I call Sheriff Bo Kincaid." Kincaid, standing near the door, looked surprised but came forward. He was sworn in. "Sheriff," Maeve said, "have you seen this hammer mark before?" Kincaid bent, examining the fitting. He ran a thumb over the dent. He nodded. "I have. It's from the smith, the one-eyed man at Bitter Wash." Breen objected again. "Irrelevant. What does a blacksmith's tool have to do with this?" "Bitter Wash," Maeve said, turning to the judge, "is the known headquarters for the Copper Spur Boys. Is that correct, Sheriff?" Kincaid sighed. "It is common knowledge. Yes." The courtroom temperature seemed to drop. Abner Tolliver, for the first time, looked uncomfortable. "Exhibit B," Maeve said, placing a single sheet of paper on the judge's bench. "This is a transcription I made from Mr. Tolliver's own bank ledger, which he was kind enough to leave open. It shows a payment, dated 3 days ago, for $50, paid to Sia's freight." Tolliver leaped from his chair. "Forgery. This is outrageous. She has stolen bank records. Sit down. Mr. Tolliver." Hollander roared, his gavel crashing. "You will speak when spoken to, or I will have you in a cell for contempt. Freight. How interesting." "Exhibit C," Maeve said. She laid down a piece of paper. "A clean drawing. This is my father's Hollis brand, a simple H. And this," she pointed to a second drawing, "is how I found it altered on my own cattle, in a holding pen at Red Butte, altered with a running iron to read H/A, brand Mr. Merritt has been using." Breen laughed out loud, a sharp, barking sound. "Your Honor, this is farce. We are deciding the future of this county based on a woman's drawings. On her fantasies about rustlers, this is a waste of the court's time." "I have one final piece of evidence," Maeve said, her voice steady. "I call Elias Rook." Elias walked to the stand. He placed his hand on the Bible, his gaze meeting Hollander's. He looked as rooted and calm as a mountain. "Mr. Rook," Maeve began. "Where were you 2 nights ago, during the hailstorm?" "I was in Coyote Wash, with Mrs. Hollis. We were attempting to bring this pipe fitting to you, Your Honor." "And what happened in the wash?" Elias spoke, his voice low and factual, recounting the ambush, the 5 riders on the rim, the shots, the trap at Needlecut. "And who led these men?" "Silas Merritt. He was not masked." A collective gasp went through the room. Silas just stared at Elias, his knuckles white where he gripped the table. "And did you speak to Mr. Merritt?" "Yes, he offered Mrs. Hollis $500 for a quitclaim deed to her land. He said he would give her peace. When she refused, he signaled his men to fire on us. The flood came before they could." The courtroom exploded. Hollander pounded his gavel, his face a mask of thunder. "Order, order, or I will clear this room." When silence was restored, he looked at Breen. "Your witness." Breen walked slowly toward Elias, his slick smile back in place. This was his territory. "Mr. Rook, you are a ranchero. I believe you live in Rook's Draw. You own no land. Do you—" "I work my claim. I have grazing rights." "Indeed. And you've taken a keen interest in Mrs. Hollis's affairs. Have you not fixing her fences, repairing her roof?" Breen paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Working rather late, I understand." Elias's eyes narrowed. "I help a neighbor." "A neighbor?" Breen boomed, turning to the jury box, though there was no jury. He was playing to the crowd. "A neighbor who you spend your days and nights with, alone, at her cabin." "Objection," Maeve said, her voice tight. "He is maligning the witness." "It goes to the witness's credibility." "Your Honor," Breen snapped. "This is not a conspiracy. This is a sordid domestic dispute. My client, a hard-working man, returns home only to find his wife has taken up with a penniless drifter. They concoct this wild story of ambush and forgery to cover their own shame." Silas, on cue, buried his face in his hands, a perfect picture of a wronged husband. The crowd was eating it up, the whispers turning venomous. "Adultery?" Breen turned back to Elias, his voice a razor. "Mr. Rook, answer the question. Were you, or were you not, alone with Mrs. Hollis inside her locked cabin for the entire night preceding this hearing?" This was the trap. Elias was frozen. He looked at Maeve, his face a mask of agony. If he said yes, he confirmed the slander, destroying her reputation and his credibility. If he said no, he committed perjury. Before he could answer, Maeve stood. Her voice did not rise. It simply cut. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hollis, you are out of order," Hollander warned, his gavel raised. "Mr. Breen is correct," Maeve said, walking past her table into the open space between them all. The room went dead silent. "This case is about my honor, but he is mistaken as to what my honor is." She turned, not to the judge, but to Silas. "My husband left me alone in a high-desert cabin for 8 months, without a word, without a dollar. He returned, not for me, but to steal my land. When I refused, he burned my winter feed. He sent armed men to ambush me in a canyon and to kill me in a flood. He used forgery to steal my water and a hot iron to steal my cattle." Her voice was shaking, but not with fear, with rage. She turned back to Judge Hollander. "My honor is not some delicate thing to be locked away. It is not a banknote, and it is not a marriage license that is honored by only one party. My honor is this land. It is the fence I built with my own hands. It is the roof I patched. It is the water my father found and the stock he raised." She pointed one trembling, bandaged finger at Elias. "Mr. Rook is a good man. He helped me defend my honor. My husband—" She turned and pinned Silas with a look of pure contempt. "Tried to burn it to the ground. Now you tell me, Your Honor, which of these men is the adulterer?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fan seemed to have stopped squeaking. Judge Hollander stared at Maeve for a long, long time. His face was unreadable. He looked at Tolliver, who was visibly sweating. He looked at Silas, who was no longer acting, his face purple with rage. Hollander lifted his gavel and slammed it down. Bang! This court is not blind, Mr. Breen, and it is not deaf. This court finds the testimony regarding C.S. Freight and the Bitter Wash Smithy, corroborated by Sheriff Kincaid, to be credible and deeply disturbing. He pointed the gavel at Tolliver. It suggests a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud and armed intimidation, originating from that bank. Tolliver looked as though he'd been shot. Therefore, this court orders the following, pending a full investigation by the Territorial Marshal, which I am requesting immediately. 1. The water contract presented by Mr. Tolliver is suspended. All work on the pipeline at Cedar Gulch is to cease immediately. Sheriff Kincaid, you will seal that pipeline personally. 2. This court opens a formal investigation into the criminal activities of the Copper Spur Boys and their association with Mr. Silas Merritt and Mr. Abner Tolliver. 3. Hollander continued, his voice booming. The matter of the water, this land was worked by Arlen Hollis for 20 years. By the doctrine of prior appropriation, the primary water rights belong to the heir who works the land. This court grants temporary and full seasonal water rights to Mrs. Maeve Hollis, effective immediately. Bang! This hearing is adjourned. The room exploded. People were shouting, standing on benches. Maeve swayed, her hand gripping the table. Elias was beside her, his hand on her elbow, steadying her. They pushed through the crowd. On the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun was blinding. They saw them, Silas, Breen, and Tolliver, huddled near their horses. Tolliver was pleading. Breen was packing his briefcase, his face furious. Silas, his mask of civility gone, grabbed Tolliver by his silk vest. He hissed something in the banker's ear, his voice too low to be heard, but his face a mask of pure violence. He said it ends on paper, Elias said quietly, beside Maeve. It begins in the field. She finished. Sheriff Kincaid came up to them, buckling his gun belt. His face was grim. That was a hell of a thing. Mrs. Hollis, you just put a stick in the biggest hornet's nest in this territory? He looked at the sun, which was already sinking. My advice, go to the hotel. Do not go back to Cedar Gulch. Do not be alone tonight. Maeve looked at the tired, good man. Then her gaze went to Elias, who was walking toward the wagon, the crowd parting around him. I appreciate your advice, Sheriff, she said, but I'm going home. She walked to the wagon. Elias looked up, a silent question in his eyes. He had heard the warning. Maeve looked at the man who had stood with her, who had faced the flood, who had been willing to be shamed in court to protect her. I haven't been alone, Maeve said, her voice for him only. Since you hit that first fence post. A slow understanding passed over his face. He nodded once, a gesture of deep, solid commitment. He gave her his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. They rode out of Mesilla Crossing, leaving the noise and the paper victory behind. The wagon, empty of its burden of proof, felt light. The setting sun cast long, cold shadows across the trail. They knew, both of them, that the real storm had not even begun. The ride home was a long, cold study in silence. The paper victory in Mesilla felt thin, a brittle piece of paper that could be torn by the first sharp wind, and the wind was coming. As they topped the rise overlooking Cedar Gulch, the last of the sun vanished, plunging the world into a deep, bruised purple. The air was wrong. It was dead still. The high desert, usually alive with the sound of the wind, held its breath. It was the silence of a held trigger. Check the stock, Elias said, his voice low. He didn't unhitch the wagon. He took his rifle. I'll check the perimeter. Maeve moved to the corral. The calves and her horse, Maggie, were clustered by the trough, their heads up, sniffing the air, their fear a palpable thing. Night fell. It did not creep in, it slammed down. A heavy, starless, moonless blackness. Dark night, and with the darkness, the wind returned. It did not rise, it attacked. It screamed down from Devil's Notch, a high, thin howl that sounded like a woman's shriek. Then, through the wind, came the smell. It was not wood smoke. It was not the clean scent of pinon. It was the sharp, greasy smell of coal oil. "Maeve!" Elias's voice was a sharp crack from the north pasture. "Kerosene." She turned. A small, orange flower bloomed in the darkness. 100 yards away, then another, and another. A dozen torches tossed into the dry grass surrounding the ranch. The grass, cured by the long drought and soaked in oil, did not catch. It exploded, a sound like a giant's fast exhale. Whoosh! A wall of fire roared to life, a 10-foot-high crescent of roaring flame that lit the ranch yard in a flickering, hellish light. "They're driving us," Maeve breathed, her hand on the cabin door. "Away from the cabin!" Elias yelled, running toward her, his rifle ready. "They're pushing us to the barn!" Hoofbeats, the high, yipping cries of the Copper Spur boys. They rode just outside the fire line, silhouettes against the flames, firing their rifles into the air, their shouts a mix of drunken glee and rage. They were the beaters in a hunt, using the fire to flush their prey. Maeve looked north, toward the high gully that overlooked the ranch. She saw him, a single figure, sitting his horse, watching. He was too far to make out features, but she knew the shape. Abner Tolliver. He wore a dark, heavy traveling coat, and he sat perfectly still, the puppet master observing his stage. The heat was already intense. Embers, carried by the wind, began to rain down on the cabin's roof. "The calves!" Maeve screamed. The small herd was in the corral attached to the barn, running the fence line, their eyes white with terror. "Get them!" Elias shouted. "I'll hold the yard." He took a position behind the stone well. Resting his rifle on the rim, a rider, bolder than the rest, broke from the fire line. Elias fired, one shot. The horse screamed and fell, pitching the rider into the dirt. The man scrambled back toward the flames. They had their warning. The fire was closing. The cabin was lost. It was the barn or nothing. Maeve ran to the corral. The main gate was secured with a heavy chain. "Silas!" The voice was not from the fire line. It was from the darkness, from the barn itself. Silas Merritt stepped from the deep shadows of the main barn entrance. He had not come with the riders. He had been waiting. He stood, feet planted, the double-barreled shotgun held level at his hip. "It's over, Maeve," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. He was silhouetted against the dark opening, the firelight gleaming on the long steel barrels. "The judge is in Mesilla. The law's a long way away. Drop the rope." She froze, her hand on the chain. "I said, drop it." He took a step forward. He never saw Elias. Elias had circled, using the well and the horse trough as cover. He was not in the yard. He was at the side of the barn, near the heavy sliding door for the hayloft. Silas took another step, raising the shotgun. "I'll kill them first. Maeve, then him, then you. Drop the—" A deafening, grinding roar. Elias yanked the lever for the hay door. The massive, 12-foot-tall door shot sideways on its cast-iron track, sealing the main entrance, plunging Silas into absolute darkness. Boom! The shotgun blast was deafening, muffled by the wood. Splinters exploded from the inside of the door. Silas was trapped. "Rook!" Silas's scream was a high, thin sound of pure fury. Boom! Another blast, this one tearing a hole in the pine wall. He was trapped between the heavy outer door and the iron-fenced stalls of the corral. "Maeve now!" Elias yelled. Maeve tore the chain from the gate. She jumped on Maggie's bare back, grabbing a fistful of mane. "Hiya, hiya!" She drove her horse into the panicked calves, forcing them through the gate. The fire was closer now, the wind a blizzard of hot sparks. She drove the calves toward the only safe place, the wide, damp irrigation ditch that ran along the property line. A shower of sparks, thrown from the roof of the burning hay shed. "Rain down," Maeve cried out, covering her face. A large, glowing ember landed in her hair, hissing, the smell of burnt hair sharp and sickening. "Maeve!" Elias was there. He ripped his own patched coat from his back and threw it over her head, smothering the spark, his arm wrapping around her, nearly pulling her from the horse. "Go get them to the water go." He pushed her, and she rode, half blind, the coat clutched to her head, driving the calves before her into the muddy safety of the ditch. As she reached the water, a new sound cut the night, a volley of shots. Not the scattered, drunken firing of the Copper Spur boys. This was a clean, disciplined volley, and it came from the main track, from behind the attackers. Elias, hunkered by the well, saw it, a single lantern, raised high, flashing a signal. 2 beats, a pause, 2 beats, on, pause, on. Sheriff Bo Kincaid, and he had the Juniper posse with him. A dozen grim-faced ranchers, their rifles speaking. The attack collapsed. The hunters became the hunted, the Copper Spur riders, caught between the firestorm and the posse, scattered. "Kincaid!" Elias roared, waving his arm. It was Lottie. It had to be Lottie. She must have seen Tolliver and Silas ride, and she had not waited. She had sounded the alarm. In the barn, Silas heard the new guns. He heard Kincaid's name. Panic replaced his rage. He slammed his shoulder against the heavy door, trying to force it open. A rider, cut off from his escape, spun his horse, his face wild with panic. He saw Silas in the cracked open doorway and raised his rifle. It was a panicked, pointless shot. Elias saw it. He saw the rifle level. He saw Silas, his back to the shooter, still fighting the door. In that split second, Elias moved. He did not think. He ran, crossing the 10 yards of open, firelit ground. He lunged, his shoulder hitting Silas square in the back, tackling him forward, into the barn. Crack! The rifle bullet tore through the air where Silas's chest had just been, burying itself deep in the barn's main beam. Elias pushed himself off a stunned, gasping Silas, who lay in the dirt. He had saved the man who had, 3 times, tried to kill him. "Stay down," Elias growled, pulling his revolver. The fire was the enemy now. It had reached the western wall of the barn, and it was crawling, hungry, toward the storage shed, toward the 50-gallon drum of lamp oil. Maeve saw it. From the ditch, she saw the flames lick at the shed. If the fire reached that drum, the barn, the men, everything would be gone. She spurred Maggie, the mare scrambling from the ditch. The oil, Elias, the oil, but she did not ride toward the drum. She rode past it, to the main head gate of the irrigation ditch, the one that controlled the flow to the entire pasture. The heavy lever was chained. She didn't have time. She pulled Elias's rifle from the saddle scabbard on Maggie. She levered around, aimed at the lock, and fired. The chain shattered. She spurred Maggie, the horse slamming her shoulder into the heavy wooden lever. With a groan of tortured wood, the head gate gave way. A wall of black, cold water, 2 feet deep, surged from the main canal, overflowing the ditch banks. It spread across the yard, a fast-moving, shallow flood. It hit the line of burning grass with a sound like a million snakes hissing. Steam billowed, thick and white, blinding. The fire line died. A burning rafter from the hay shed collapsed, rolling, a log of fire, straight toward the oil drum. Maeve wheeled Maggie. She rode straight at the burning timber, the mare snorting in terror. She drove the horse, using her shoulder to hook the timber, rolling it away from the drum, into the path of the spreading water. The fire was quenched. The yard was a chaotic mess of smoke, steam, and shouting men. The posse had rounded up the remaining Copper Spur boys, cuffed and sullen. From the North Gully, a single rider was fleeing. Tolliver, his plan in ashes. He spurred his horse, heading for Dead Juniper Bend, the one clear path away from the ranch. He rounded the bend at a full gallop and pulled his horse up so hard it almost fell. 2 figures blocked the narrow pass. Sheriff Kincaid, his shotgun leveled, and beside him, holding a lantern high, was Lottie Finch. "Leaving your accounts unsettled, Mr. Tolliver." Lottie's voice was as sharp and cold as the water in the ditch. Kincaid grabbed the horse's bridle. "Get down, banker. Your coat's caught." He reached up and yanked the heavy traveling coat open, revealing the silk vest and gold watch chain beneath. In the pocket, plain as day, was the bank's ledger of illicit payments. The puppet master was caught. In the yard, Elias pulled a dazed, soot-covered Silas to his feet. 2 deputies took him, snapping manacles onto his wrists. Silas looked around, his mind catching up. He saw Tolliver, a prisoner. He saw his riders. Cuffed. He saw the fire. Dead. He saw Maeve, walking toward him from the steam, her face black with soot, her hair singed, but her eyes burning. His composure broke. All the rage, the entitlement, the humiliation, exploded in one raw, childish scream. "I just wanted what was mine." Maeve stopped. She was breathing hard, her lungs aching from the smoke. She looked at the smoldering ruin of her hay shed. She looked at the saved barn, and the saved calves, already calming in the muddy ditch. She looked at Elias, who had come to stand beside her, his presence a solid, unmovable fact. She looked at Silas. "You left me long ago," she said, her voice rasping, but carrying over the chaos. "You left me. This land was never yours. It belongs to the one who knows how to keep it alive." The dawn came, not in fire, but in a bruised, watery gray. It revealed a landscape of devastation. The yard was a black, sucking sea of mud and ash. Steam rose in lazy, foul-smelling plumes where the floodwaters had met the last of the embers. The air was thick with the stink of wet char and coal oil. But the barn stood. Its western wall was a map of scorched, blackened timber, but it was standing. The house was untouched. And the fence, the new cedar posts Elias and Maeve had set, ran straight and true along the pasture line, the wire gleaming wetly in the new light. In the flooded irrigation ditch, the small herd of calves stood huddled, their ears drooping, their bodies trembling, but they were alive. They were all alive. Sheriff Kincaid and the Juniper posse spent the first hour of light rounding up the prisoners. Tolliver, his fine coat stained with mud, his face a mask of ruined dignity, was tied to his own horse. The Copper Spur boys, nursing bruises and rope burns, were put in a line, sullen and defeated. And Silas, he sat on the ground by the well, his hands bound, his gaze empty. He was staring at the barn, at the hole his own shotgun blast had torn. When Kincaid hauled him to his feet, he moved like a man made of straw. They brought his horse. As the deputy pushed him toward the saddle, Silas stopped. He looked across the ruined yard at Maeve. She stood near the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him. His gaze was not angry. It was not hateful. It was hollow. The fire was gone. He looked at her, at the land he had tried to destroy, at the man who stood beside her. He saw a thing he could not understand, a thing he had never possessed and could never break. It was a look of profound, absolute defeat. And somewhere, deep in his eyes, there was a flicker of something else, a strange, terrifying relief. The relief of a man who had been running a race he knew he would lose, and who was, at last, allowed to stop. He turned, mounted his horse, and did not look back. Kincaid tipped his hat to Maeve, his face weary. He rode over to Elias, who was coiling the rope Maeve had used to open the head gate. The sheriff spoke, his voice low. "For Elias alone. You saved him. Rook, I saw it. That stray bullet was meant for his back. The court will note that. They'll note a man who saves the life of the one who tried to take his—" Elias did not look up. He just continued his work, pulling the wet rope, coiling it tight, his movements economical and sure. He gave a single, short nod, acknowledging the words but offering nothing to them. Kincaid sighed. A man who had seen too much. He raised his hand in a silent farewell to Maeve and led his procession of prisoners down the track, toward Mesilla. The posse went with him, their job done, leaving Cedar Gulch in a sudden, ringing silence. The silence was heavier than the smoke. There was nothing but the drip of water from the scorched eaves and the low, nervous nickering of the calves, the adrenaline that had held Maeve together for 3 days, the rage that had fueled her, the fear that had sharpened her wits. It all drained away at once. It left her knees weak, her body hollow. A tremor started in her hands, a deep, uncontrollable shaking from pure, bone-deep exhaustion. She stumbled to the cabin porch, the same steps where they had sat just hours before, and collapsed onto the top step, She stared at her hands. They were raw, covered in soot and dried blood from her torn bandages. And they would not stop shaking. She tried to clench them into fists, but they disobeyed. She looked at the yard, at the mud, at the ruin, and for the first time, she did not see a fight to be won. She just saw the wreckage. Elias finished with the rope. He walked the perimeter of the barn, checking the beams, kicking at the still-hot embers. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace. He fetched a bucket and doused the last smoking spot. He saw her sitting there, shaking. He walked over, his heavy boots slow on the muddy ground. He stopped in front of her. She was looking down, her singed hair falling in a tangle, her shoulders trembling. He saw that the thick lace of her left boot, torn and caked with mud, had come undone. He said nothing. He simply knelt. He knelt in the mud at her feet, a position of sudden, shocking deference. He took the two wet, gritty ends of the bootlace. His fingers, calloused and scarred, were surprisingly gentle. He worked the mud from the lace, his movements careful, unhurried. He threaded the lace through the eyelet and pulled it tight, a firm, grounding pressure on her ankle. He tied the knot, a simple, strong bow. Maeve watched his hands. This large, quiet man, who had faced guns and floods, was kneeling in the dirt to tie her boot. The absurdity of it, the simple, profound tenderness of it, broke something inside her. A sound, half sigh, half sob, tore from her throat. "If you hadn't," she whispered, her voice a raw crackle, "that first day, if you hadn't been walking that line, if you hadn't stopped." He finished the knot, but he did not move. He remained on one knee, his head bowed. "I think I would still be standing right there," she said, the words spilling out, shaky and real. "I would still be staring at that one broken post. I would have been stuck there. Forever." Elias looked up, his gray eyes, clear and steady in his soot-stained face, met hers. He did not deny it. He did not offer false comfort. "I just brought the wire. Maeve," he said, his voice low and rough. "You were the one who pulled it tight." She looked at him, at the truth in his words, the truth that he had never once tried to save her, but had, at every turn, simply given her the tool to save herself. She leaned forward. She put her arms around his neck, burying her face in the hollow of his shoulder. Her hands, for the first time, stopped shaking. He rose from his knee, meeting her, and his arms came around her, solid and strong. He held her. It was not the desperate, fiery embrace of the cabin. It was an embrace of survival, of arrival. It was two people, battered and exhausted, who had proven to be stronger than the storm. He held her weight as she sagged against him, and he just stood, a pillar in the mud, letting her finally rest. They stood like that for a long time, silent, the sun, finally breaking through the high, thin clouds, began to warm the air. Below them, in the yard, a small flock of sparrows, emboldened by the silence, landed. They began to peck at the scattered, muddy bits of hayseed near the barn. Life was coming back. The news came 2 days later, not by Kincaid, but by Lottie Finch, who rattled her buckboard into the yard at high speed. "It's done," she announced, waving a telegram from Massilia. "Tolliver is indicted by the territorial marshals. The bank is sealed. They found all his ledgers, the real ones. He was financing the Copper Spur boys for half the ranchers in the territory, taking their payments in stolen stock. Silas was just his lowest, loudest dog." She took Maeve's hands, her sharp eyes soft. "And the judge, Maeve, the judge made it permanent. The water rights to Cedar Gulch, all of them, in your name, forever. It's yours." The next day, the neighbors came. Nico Alvarez rode in first, leading a wagon loaded with fresh-cut cedar shingles. He was followed by 2 other ranchers from the posse. They did not ask. They simply set their wagons, pulled their tools, and got to work. "A roof's a heavy job for 2, Nico said gruffly, climbing the ladder to the scorched barn. Besides, we figure a woman who can flood a field to save a barn deserves a dry roof over her cattle. By midday, there were 7 men working, their hammers a loud, rhythmic chorus of repair. Lottie came back. She carried a large parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. "This is not for your account," Lottie said firmly. Maeve opened it. Inside was a dress. It was not silk, not for town. It was a simple, sturdy dress of dark blue homespun, but it was cut well, with a clean white collar. It was the color of a clear sky. "Lottie, this is..." "It's beautiful. It's practical," Lottie corrected her, though she was pleased. "I just figured. A new start needs something decent to wear on a good day, and it looks like you'll be having a few of those." That evening, the work was done. The new roof was finished, the pale cedar a stark, fresh patch against the old, weathered wood. The neighbors packed their tools and rode out, leaving behind the smell of fresh-cut wood and a quiet that was, for the first time, truly peaceful. The sun began to set. Maeve, wearing the new dress, stood on the porch. Elias came from the barn, having fed the stock. He stopped, just watching her for a moment. He had never seen her in anything but trousers and a soot-stained shirt. She felt his gaze, a quiet warmth. "The ditch," she said, her voice soft. "I want to see the ditch." They walked, not touching, but close, their shadows stretching long beside them. They walked to the head gate she had broken. Elias had already repaired the lock, but he'd left the gate cracked open. Just enough, a steady, clean stream of water, no wider than a man's arm, gurgled from the main canal. It ran down the new, shallow channel they had dug together, heading toward the pasture. They stopped and just listened. It was the sound of life, the sound of money, of survival, of a future. It was the sound of her father's dream, finally realized. It was the quiet, constant, faithful sound of the water talking to the land. Elias looked at the water, then at her. The banked embers of their connection, subdued by the violence and the aftershock, began to glow again. A deep, steady heat. He reached out, not to grab her, but just to touch. His fingers, calloused and clean, grazed the back of her hand. She met his touch, turning her hand, her fingers lacing with his. They stood, side by side, watching the water run, their hands locked, the silence of the high desert settling around them, no longer a threat, but a promise. The new season arrived on a wind that smelled of pine and curing grama grass. In Juniper Flats, the air of fear had finally lifted. The bank was shuttered, its windows dark. The territorial marshals had taken Tolliver to Santa Fe, his ledgers chained in a strongbox beside him. It was market day, but it was also a day of reckoning. The marshal, a weary man with a gavel, was auctioning off the assets of the failed bank to pay its debts. The town gathered in the main square. They sold Tolliver's fine mahogany desk, his leather chairs, his brass-plated scale. Then they moved on to the land he had illegally foreclosed on. "Next," the marshal called out. "The lands known as the Merritt Spread, seized by this court in lieu of payment for Mr. Merritt's debts and criminal fines." The crowd stirred. This was Silas's land. The marshal broke it into parcels. The good grazing land near the river went fast, ranchers eager to expand. The main house sold to a speculator from the east. Finally, only one piece was left. "Lot 7B, the marshal announced, his voice flat. 10 acres of alkali flattened creosote, bordering the dead juniper bend. Non-arable, no water rights. Do I hear an opening bid?" The crowd was silent. This was the patch of worthless dirt Silas had always laughed about, the one he'd claimed wasn't worth a bucket of spilled water. "Do I hear $1? The marshal asked. Tired, a voice, clear and steady, cut the silence. $5. Every head turned. Maeve Hollis stood at the back of the crowd, her hand raised. She wore the blue dress Lottie had made. Elias stood beside her, his face calm. A ripple of confusion went through the ranchers. Why would she want that $5? Going once. The marshal looked at her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Twice, sold. To Mrs. Maeve Hollis for $5. The next day, Elias did not ride to Cedar Gulch. He brought Nico Alvarez's wagon and the heavy draft horse to Lot 7B. He did not bring fence posts. He brought drills, a sledgehammer, and lengths of pipe. For a week, the town watched. Elias and Maeve did not build a fence. They dug. They worked the heavy drill bit into the baked, worthless alkali soil. On the third day, the drill came up wet. It was not the main aquifer, but it was water, sweet, clean, and shallow. Elias, with the help of Nico and 2 other ranchers, built a heavy timber frame over the hole. He set a simple, robust iron hand pump. He built a low, wide trough of cypress wood. On the next market day, the town gathered again, this time not for an auction, but for a dedication. A wagon train, heading south, was pulling through town. It was the prison transport, heavily guarded, taking Silas Merritt and the last of the Copper Spur boys to the territorial prison at Yuma. The wagon was forced to stop at the crossroads, its path blocked by the crowd. Silas, his hands and feet in chains, looked out through the barred window of the wagon. He saw the patch of alkali flat, his land. He saw the new-cut timber. He saw the pump, and he saw a small boy, Nico Alvarez's son, run up to the pump and work the handle. Clean water gushed into the trough. He saw Maeve, standing by the well, watching him. Silas stared. He understood. This was not a prison. This was not a hanging. This was his sentence. His greed, his attempt to hoard, had been answered by a public well, on his worthless land, giving away for free the one thing he had tried to keep. His shoulders, which had been rigid with hate, slumped. For the first time, Silas Merritt bowed his head. The guard shouted. The whip cracked, and the wagon moved on. Carrying a truly broken man, Maeve turned to the crowd. Sheriff Kincaid stood beside her, his hat in his hand. Lottie Finch was at his side. Maeve held up a small, newly cut iron key for the pump's maintenance lock. She did not keep it. She handed it, jointly, to the sheriff and to Lottie. One for the law, one for the people. This water, Maeve said, her voice carrying in the quiet, flows for those who keep their word. At the edge of the small gathering, Elias finished his work. He had taken the small cedar shingle, the one carved with 2 words. From the gate at Cedar Gulch, he had repaired it, sanded it, and oiled it. He nailed it to the heavy timber frame of the new public well. Stay true. The words were not just for a fence anymore. They were for the whole town. As the sun began to set, they rode the wagon back to Cedar Gulch. The noise of the town faded behind them. There was a new quiet between them. The fight was done. The last account was settled. They stopped the wagon on the rise, the same rise where Silas had first found them. They looked out at their land. The fence line they had built with their own hands ran true, the wire catching the last red light of the sun. It no longer looked like a defense. It was not a barrier. It was just a line, a clean, sharp mark on the earth, stretching all the way to the horizon, like the first line drawn on a map of the future. The air was cool, the wind a gentle breath that carried the scent of the new grass growing along their irrigation ditch. Elias turned, not to her, but reaching into the pocket of his coat. He did not speak. He did not kneel. He was not a man for grand gestures. He was a man of iron and wood, of substance. He held out his hand. In his calloused, scarred palm lay a small, simple ring. It was not gold or silver. It was dark, forged iron, beaten into a perfect circle, polished smooth. She recognized the metal. It was from an old railroad spike, the kind that held the new world together. Maeve looked at the ring, a circle of iron forged in fire, strong enough to hold a world together. Then she looked at his face. His gray eyes were steady, holding the last of the light. He was asking, in the only way he knew how. She did not say yes. She did not need to. She lifted her hand, not to take the ring, but to lay her palm flat against his chest. She felt the steady, strong beat of his heart under her hand. Here, she whispered, her voice thick. All the vows are already knotted. He let out a slow breath, a breath he had been holding. He took her left hand, his touch rough and sure, and slid the iron ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He leaned in. They kissed, there on the open ridge, under a vast, purple sky. The fire that had been between them, the desperate cabin fever heat of the storm, was gone. It had been replaced by something else. It was not the wild, consuming flame of a haystack, but the steady, contained, generative warmth of a hearth. It was a fire that had been tested, that had been fed, and that had chosen to stay. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder, her hand with its new ring resting over his heart. They stood for a long time, watching the first stars appear. From the valley, over a mile away, they heard it, carried on the clear, high desert wind. A new sound from the center of town. It was the high, thin sound of the pump handle, and the faint, clear echo of children laughing as they splashed in the new, clean water. Here at Cedar Gulch, love and justice had finally come to stand on the same fence line, pulled taut and not easily broken. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please share your thoughts and where you are in the comments below. Join the conversation. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.